Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us today. A few weeks back I was made aware of a channel called Don't Sphere the Truth, who's published some videos in response to mine, and one in particular seems to have grabbed people's attention regarding why objects at the horizon disappear bottom up. Quite a few people have commented about it on my videos. Jaren brought it up in a debate he was having with Fight the Flat Earth, and there seems to be a mirror of the video on what looks like one of Flat Earth Dave's channels, apparently schooling me on the topic. Now, I'm not going to cover all of Don't Sphere the Truth's video in one go. Partly because it's almost an hour long, but mainly because the original topic was about us seeing objects disappear from view, and yet Don't Sphere the Truth has a section from Taboo Conspiracies talking all about radio signals. In particular, claims that the German Knickerbein system in World War II would only work on flat Earth, but I would argue it actually only makes sense on a globe. But that is an interesting topic that deserves its own explanation, so I'm going to do a separate video tackling that, because I don't want this video to be too long. I'm being strategical in my counter-offensive. You could say it comes from my many years of playing World of Tanks, who, incidentally, are sponsoring this video. World of Tanks is a free-to-play tanking game with a choice of over 800 playable tanks, be it light, medium or heavy tanks, artillery or tank destroyers, many of which were actually used throughout history. Like I said, I've personally played World of Tanks for many years, and I particularly love the strategic aspect of having to know the strengths and weaknesses of your tanks versus those of your opponent and trying to play to those advantages, such as angling your tank to increase armor protection, using the terrain to hide the vulnerable spots of your tank, lure your opponent into the open and then target their exposed weak points, or coordinating with your teammates to work together on a strategy to secure victory. There are over 40 maps with mixtures of city streets, forests, deserts, narrow passages, open plains and much more to really spice up the action and further push that need for tactics. New players signing on using my link below along with the invitation code COMBAT can earn themselves a free Cromwell B tank, 250,000 credits, 7 days of premium access along with rentals of a Type 64, T78 and the legendary Tiger 131 for 10 battles each. But don't worry if you're already an existing World of Tanks player, because if you use the same code of combat, you can get 3 days of premium accounts, a free camouflage called Bargain, and rental of the Centurion Mark V for 7 days or 10 battles. If you already have the Centurion Mark V, you can get 100,000 credits instead. So let's get into Don't Sphere the Truth's explanations for why objects disappear bottom up. Although, just to save time for the rest of the video, I'm going to initialize their name to DST. They start by saying it's because of inferior mirages.
The result is a classic mirage, where objects appear below their actual position.
As the helicopter lands, you see its landing gear begin to vanish into the mirage. This is only one of a few different ways bottom-first obstruction occurs on our flat Earth.
This sequence is one of my favorite sequences with mirages. You can see it in the distance. You don't know what that is. It looks like a spaceship coming at you. Yeah. It's a black blob, and this is on a highway in New Mexico. You have no idea what it is, and slowly it emerges. It still looks like a spaceship right there. But then when we get up here, you see it. It's a car with 2 trucks behind it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it?
Inferior mirages can appear to distort objects. They're caused by the refraction of light. When light travels through different density mediums, it bends. So if you shine a light into a pane of glass but on an angle, one side of the light beam hits the denser medium of the glass first, which drags the beam towards the glass. When it exits the glass, if one side exits first, it's in the less dense medium of air, while the other side is still in the more dense medium of glass, and so it bends again. It's the same when traveling through air. As air density decreases with altitude, then normally the denser air is low down, and so light would always be gradually refracting towards the ground. However, as the sun heats the ground up, it can radiate heat, which will warm the air up just above it. This decreases the density of the air. with enough of a change in density, the light that would normally have travelled straight towards the ground way out in front of you actually winds up being bent to such a degree that you end up seeing it from your location. I've actually shown examples of this in previous videos, such as F1 cars on the grid, and we can see a reflection of them in the tarmac, or more impressive when we see a reflection of an aeroplane in the runway as it's coming into land, and even parts of it appearing to melt into the tarmac. This is similar to the helicopter example that DST is presenting. All of the light from the helicopter is being bent upwards, so the light that would have normally have travelled from the landing gear to our eye has been refracted up and out over our head, and the light from the fuselage that would have shone into the ground has instead been refracted up into our eye, causing the illusion that the helicopter's landing gear has disappeared. However, that does not fit with what we observe for objects at the horizon. In the examples of mirages that DST presents, there are a few common aspects. Firstly, there is a reflection of the object below it. The presence of the mirage bending the light from the bottom of the object up out of our sight also causes light that would have normally have fallen short of us to become visible, i.e. the top of the object or the sky, neither of which can be seen in the footage of the boat disappearing from view. Secondly, the heat haze. Mirages are caused by warm air rising from Earth's surface, and as it rises, it cools, so the refraction levels then decrease. This means that while the light from parts of the object closest to the ground will get the most amount of refraction, the light from higher parts is still travelling through warm air, but it's not warm enough to bend it completely out of sight. Instead, it causes a haze across the object, with it appearing to shimmer and distort. Just take the tail rotor of the helicopter, for example. When we see the helicopter flying normally, the tail boom is perfectly straight. As it comes into land, though, it now appears to be very highly distorted because of the heat haze. Same can be seen with the aeroplanes coming into land on the runway, and yet ships going over the horizon have nowhere near that amount of distortion. Thirdly, when we see parts of an object appearing to vanish into a mirage, they look like they're almost melting into the ground. The feet of the helicopter stretch into the ground before vanishing. Same with the aeroplane's engines on the runway. The entire section that DST shows about cars on the road is how they distort into their miraged reflections. But again, we're not seeing that with these ships. There's a clearly defined break between the ship and the sea, and the ship isn't distorting. And mirages only happen in certain conditions, which is why the most common examples of mirages are in places like the desert or on dark tarmac roads, which get incredibly hot and are always shown happening on bright sunny days. Every ship that we see sail out to sea eventually disappears from view and always bottom first, and every ship returning appears top down. For that to be because of mirages, the mirages would need to be permanent. Not just happening on hot sunny days, but on cold days, cloudy days, and even at night. That is obviously not to say that mirages over water can't happen, but on average, the effects are nowhere near as severe as we see on land, and the times that they do happen to such extreme manners are very rare. And the mirage's explanation also suffers from a major problem regarding observer height. Just like how the refraction effect reduces as the object height increases, so too it does with the observer height. It's why in the helicopter example that DST shows, the camera has been set up on a tripod with the lens retracted and the videographer is knelt down near the ground, because the camera is kept as low as possible. The higher above ground the observer and/or the object is, the less the mirage effect we see. And here, even with a very strong mirage that is causing a lot of noticeable heat haze and a strong reflection of the helicopter, the landing gear of the helicopter only disappears just before it touches down. And once it's landed, it can go no lower. The mirage effect is only hiding the bottom 2 feet or so of the helicopter, from a vantage point that it itself is only 2 or 3 feet above the ground. Here is a photograph published on Blackpool Tower's Facebook page showing the tower from the summit of Great Orme in North Wales, nearly 47 miles away. The summit of Great Orme is 207 metres or 679 feet above sea level. Blackpool Tower is listed as 158 metres high from ground to tip, and that includes the building around the base. That building is almost 1/5 of the total height of Blackpool Tower, so approximately 28.7 metres high. The building itself is set back from the sea, and there is a drop of a sea wall in order to get to sea level. So I think 30 metres or 98 feet would be a fair rough estimate for the height of the top of that building above sea level. And yet, from the observer's position in Great Orme, that building is not visible. Now, there does seem to be a hint of a mirage along the waterline. However, the problem for Flat Earth is that the observer position is higher than the whole of Blackpool Tower. Meaning, on a flat Earth, the observer's line of sight to the top of that building would start 207 metres above sea level and would finish 30 metres above sea level. So for any mirage to cause obstruction to it, would need to be at least 30 metres high. And that's assuming the mirage is happening on the ground right in front of the building. If the mirage is happening out at sea, then it needs to be even bigger, otherwise the observer would be looking over the top of it. However, if we consider a globe, then the line of sight between those two locations would actually skirt just above Earth's surface as it gets to the horizon. So, in that instance, a very mild heat haze would actually still impact our vision. That actually ties in nicely to DST's next examples, which come from Life is Short. This involves a few different clips, two looking over a lake, one during the day and one at night, looking at a light across the lake, and showing that if the camera is placed near the water, then objects can disappear from view. The one in the day doesn't make particularly clear what the object is that we're looking at, but I think it's a fair assumption to say that it is something floating at the water's edge across the lake, so it's right next to sea level. The nighttime clip is using a light that has been set up 2.5 inches above the waterline. Life is Short then lowers his phone camera down and states that as his phone case touches the water, the light disappears.
And there I'm just barely touching the ground, touching the water. You can see the ripples just starting as the iPhone case just touches the water.
And then states that that means the observer height when the light disappears is about 1/2 inch above the water. So when that happens, the observer is lower than the light source. The light source must therefore be travelling downwards into slightly denser air, and so refracting. But it hits the same problem as the mirage notion. A tiny amount of refraction when you are so close to the ground can cause the light from the object to basically nosedive into the ground in front of you. However, that stops happening as soon as you raise up slightly above ground, and especially when you are above the object that you're viewing. So it does not explain why 30 metres of Blackpool is missing, or why ships disappear over the horizon even when we are standing on a cliff or high up on another ship.
So as I lower myself in this perspective here, and I have a light visible across about 500 feet of distance along a hallway, you can see that the light is visible at first, and then as I lower myself, how perspective changes, and how at a certain point the light is no longer visible. If we go from a hallway into an outdoor setting and we just change our horizon distance, there's no reason why this isn't a different aspect of perspective. It's the same exact thing. We're just outdoors, and instead of looking at a flashlight, we are now looking at a cruise ship or a boat or something else going over.
Life is Short also shows examples where they've set up a light on a floor of a building some 500 feet away from the camera, and when the camera is right down near the floor, the light cannot be seen, but when the camera is raised up just by a foot, they can see it. And that the light has apparently disappeared from view because it's reached a vanishing point. Although that would imply that the vanishing point on a flat Earth is when your eye is next to the ground, but things should still be visible when you're 6 feet above the ground. Instead, the claim from DST heads into some sort of compression angles, which I'll get onto in a bit. The more likely reason why that light was obscured, though, is the floor is not smooth. There are bumps and ripples in the reflections of that all over the floor, so any unevenness in the surface would block the light from getting to you if your vantage point is that close to the ground. Funnily enough, pointed out by Life is Short in a separate experiment.
Now we're at secondary to small obstructions within perspective. So within our floor example here, the last 3 golf balls are all on the same horizon line, and they no longer ascend within perspective. The floor tiles are a bit uneven in this case, and if there were an obstruction nearby, say 7 feet away, it would obscure the image further away at 130 feet.
Now, he's losing sight of these balls 100 feet away because the floor is getting in the way, and the light he lost sight of was 500 feet away. Essentially, he is perfectly demonstrating here how a non-flat surface can obscure your view of an object. Which then brings us nicely to the next point that DST tries claiming, that because objects' angular size becomes smaller and smaller the further away they get, then when a boat is very small out at sea, any tiny object, such as a wave, much closer to us, would obscure its view.
Another way objects can become obscured bottom first on a flat plane is simply due to foreground objects, such as uneven ground, grass, waves, swells, etc.
Given a 6-foot observer height with 1 arc minute of resolution, how big would a wave have to be 0.25 miles away to obstruct a 250-foot tall cruise ship 20 miles away? So it's the same relationship, 250 feet of cruise ship 20 miles away versus X amount of obstruction a quarter mile away, and you would get a wave of 3 feet.
And I've seen a few flat earthers make this sort of claim, that the bottom of ships disappear because of waves, that a small wave near you would block the view of a ship far off in the distance. Sure, in the same way that my thumb can block my view of the moon, even though the moon is much larger than my thumb, the slight gap in their logic with that explanation though, my thumb only blocks the moon when I move it into the direct line of sight between my eye and the moon. My eyes are 5.5 feet above the ground. If the moon is 45 degrees up in the sky, then raising my thumb at arm's length to cover the moon now puts my thumb 7 feet above the ground. If you're standing on a beach viewing ships and you're about 6 feet above sea level, if a wave was 6 foot tall, it would have to be on the beach right in front of your eye to obscure your view. And in exactly the same way that the ship shrinks towards a vanishing point as it goes away from you, so too does everything else, including waves. A 6-foot wave right in front of you would block the whole ship. A 6-foot wave right next to the ship would only block the bottom 6 feet. Life is Short tries claiming that a tiny little 3-foot wave would obscure your view of a ship at sea, but he has an observer height of 6 feet, and the ship itself is higher than 6 feet, so that 3-foot wave would never intersect your line of sight. It's like if you're 6 foot tall and you're standing on a road, and then away down the road is another 6-foot person, and you get a small child to run between the two of you, by Life is Short's logic, as that child runs down the road, they should block your view of the other person, which wouldn't happen. The only way it would happen is if the road wasn't flat and there was a hill in the middle. Now, here is some data I found on waves from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Based on a scenario of a 30-knot wind in a 340-mile stretch of open ocean, the average wave height is 11 feet. The most frequent wave height was 8.5 feet. However, because waves are both cresting and troughing, the way they actually measure wave height is from the bottom of the trough to the tip of the crest, with mean sea level being halfway in between, meaning the average wave of 11 feet is 11 feet from crest to trough. Only 5.5 feet of it is actually above mean sea level. So standing with your eye line 6 foot above mean sea level, the average wave would never block your view, even if it was right in front of you. Now, the top 10% of the biggest waves had an average height of 22 feet. So that's 22 feet from crest to trough. So 11 feet from mean sea level to the tip, the bit that we would actually really see from the beach. Now, on a flat Earth, if we're standing 6 foot tall, the bottom 6 feet of the wave would never obscure our view. Only the top 5 feet of it would. So based on this idea of Earth being flat and the angular size of the wave just needs to be bigger than that of the ship to obscure it, if we're standing with our eyes 6 foot above the ground, then both the bottom 6 foot of the wave and the bottom 6 feet of the ship become irrelevant. Now, the ship disappears from view at 19 miles. That's 100,000 feet. The ship itself is 177 feet high, so we ignore the bottom 6 feet that's below our eye line. That leaves us with 171 feet. At 100,000 feet away, that gives an angular size of 0.09797 degrees. The top 5 foot of wave will reach that angular size 2,923 feet away from the observer, which is 0.89 kilometers or 0.55 miles. So almost 1 kilometer or just over half a mile. Any further than that, the top of that wave would not be obscuring the top of the ship on a flat Earth. Now, those 22-foot waves was only the average of the top 10% of waves, and those are figures based on waves way out in the open ocean, nowhere near land, and with a consistent 30-knot wind, which on calm days, the sea waves are nowhere near that high. Also, all of that is based on an observer height of 6 feet. If we go back to the view of Blackpool from Great Orme, the observer height is 207 metres, 679 feet above sea level, and 30 metres or 98 feet of Blackpool Tower is missing. That would require a 98-foot wave parking itself on the front door of the building to obscure it that much. If the wave was any further away from the building towards the observer, the height needed to obscure the line of sight would increase. So if the wave was in the middle of the sea, halfway between the observer and Blackpool, it would need to be about 300 feet high in order to block the observer's view. And I kind of think somebody might have noticed if there was a tsunami in the middle of the Irish Sea. The only way that this flat earther's idea of small waves blocking our view could actually work is if the sea level was raised up in between the two observation points. And this sort of circles back to DST's compression angle claim that I mentioned earlier. And it can't be that we can't resolve the bottom 6 foot of objects 3 miles away because of limits to our vision, because that would then mean that we couldn't resolve the bottom 6 foot of any object that's 3 miles away. And yet we can resolve the bottom 6 foot of a plane when it's 3 miles away, no problem.
That's because there is no ground to compress your bottom visual angle while looking at objects in the sky. It's not until they reach your visual horizon that things will be cut off from your view.
Which doesn't actually really offer any explanation, just that as the angle between an object and the horizon comes close to 0, then the object disappears. No mechanics as to why or what causes it, or even what that specific trigger angle is. That 177-foot ship at 19 miles has an angular size of 0.101414 degrees. So that's an angular size from the ground on flat Earth to the top of it, and at that angle it's disappeared. Blackpool Tower in this photo is 46.86 miles away. 158 metres or 518 feet to the top of it gives it an angular size of 0.119 degrees, and yet 4/5 of it is still visible. Now, sure, they're from different elevations, but if the compression angle is getting near 0 to your horizontal, then that would mean the top of the tower would hit the compression angle first because the observer is higher than the tower. If the compression angle is to the horizon, then that means that this angle would change from horizontal depending on your height. How does the light know how high you are, if it needs to vanish or not? And that draws us back to the corridor example. Life is Short fills that image with converging lines and says that objects disappear when they reach a vanishing point.
Just remember that as you lower your eye height, you're cramming more and more information into a smaller space and it gets lost. So, but it remains 50% of your vision. So the floor is still 50% even though you're not seeing as far along the floor. So what happens to that information in the distance? It disappears essentially into this, what I'll term, I guess, a horizon gap.
And even if we were to say that there's a specific angle to the horizon that would make objects within that disappear, anything above that angle should look perfectly fine. And yet in the photo of Blackpool Tower, there is a ship on the horizon which is positioned higher than where the bottom of Blackpool Tower would be. If this was a flat Earth, then the boat should be well below Blackpool Tower, not overlapping where the bottom of the building should be located.
Same thing here. Again, at different heights, you can see how I'm compressing different information. So when I'm 8 foot tall, the ceiling is getting compressed. And as I get down to 1 foot tall, or 0 feet, or essentially half a centimeter off, the floor is getting compressed. And this is just an aspect of how our vision works.
Now, I think I understand what Life is getting at here, but it doesn't really seem relevant to the argument. He's saying that the details in the floor of the corridor become harder to make out as you get lower to the floor. And likewise, as you get closer to the ceiling, you struggle to see the details in the ceiling far away because of compression. Now, this is an aspect of our vision, but it's not relevant in the topic of why objects disappear bottom first. We live in a three-dimensional space, which means there are 3 dimensions to us. There is left and right, an x-axis, there is up and down, the y-axis, and then there is forwards and backwards, which is the z-axis. If you hold your phone in front of you and you've got it vertical, the screen is running along the y-axis. If you tilt the phone down, its screen is now running along the z-axis. And the closer to parallel that your line of sight is to the z-axis, then the less of the screen that you can read. Or if you're standing next to a long table, you can clearly see the detail in the surface of the table at the far end, but as you crouch down next to the table, those details in the surface become harder to make out, because your line of sight is coming close to parallel to the surface, but the details near you become hard to see as well. And where this becomes irrelevant is we're not talking about seeing the surface of the ocean, we're talking about seeing objects that are on the y-axis, that are vertical from the ocean. You place an object on the table at the far end, you'll crouch down, you can't make out the surface details of the table, but the object still remains perfectly visible and will only start to disappear if you dip your eye below the table, and then therefore the table surface is obstructing your view of the object, which would be Earth curvature. Most ships, for centuries, placed their lookouts high up in crow's nests. The first parts of ships that they would see coming into view would be the tops of them. If you had 2 identical ships with lookout posts 100 feet high, the lookouts would be the same height as each other above sea level. Sailing away from each other over a flat Earth, the line of sight between the observers would remain perfectly parallel to sea level and would always be 100 feet above the sea level. The angle between them wouldn't change. And finally, DST brings up a video from Jay Tolan Media, who thinks he's proven flat Earth using photogrammetry software.
The software I'll be using is called Metashape. Here's the flight path, the red line. I flew from Chicago to Buffalo this spring, and I was looking towards the north, and I took some really clear images, as you see right here. This area is usually covered in clouds, but on this particular day, the western side was clear, as you can see here, and we can almost see Lake Michigan on the left, curving around way out there. So we're really seeing about, over 200 miles out. So here I've imported all the images. Okay, so the processing is done, and now we have this dense cloud to work with. Wow, look at that. Whoa.
Now, this kind of software takes a series of images, finds matching reference points, and stitches them together to create a movable projection. It's essentially measuring parallax, because the camera moves, so everything in the frame moves, but how much any object appears to move depends on how far away it is from the camera. And so the software can measure this parallax shift and try and estimate how far away objects are relative to each other.
That is incredible, folks. Yeah, look at that. See? It is pretty flat. Now, don't worry, we're gonna do a little bit more analysis here, but this is just a visual to get us all excited, because this is really incredible, technology,
Which amazes Jay Tolin that this can be done. Yet, strangely, flat earthers will dismiss parallax measuring in a heartbeat when we use it to measure the distance to the moon. Now, Jay Tolin claims that it proves flat Earth for two reasons. Firstly, because the rendered projection is flat, except the software is just stitching together 2D images taken on a single axis of movement. It would need to know to add the Earth curvature in, which, funnily enough, is what instructions on photogrammetry say to do for land surveying. Even in the website of the manufacturer who makes this piece of software he's using, say to add corrections for Earth curvature, which seems an odd instruction if the Earth was flat. But Jay Tolin then draws some lines to represent flat Earth and globe curvature, trying to argue that the Earth must be flat because the rendered output is flat, and the reference points in the render then line up with the flat line and not the curved one.
Man, this is so flat. Oh my god. Look at that. So now let's create another line to approximate the curvature. So while I was looking at this, I realized, wait a second, I can determine how far I'm seeing based on the altitude of my photos, which are shown in the model. By using the altitude of the images as a reference, I calculated that I'm seeing data points out over 500 miles, folks. This is just incredible.
However, Jay Tolin seems to have inadvertently shot flat Earth in the foot. Firstly, as we've just covered, the software will render what it can see as flat. Curvature needs to be added into the projection. But more importantly is what we can see in the photos. He is stitching photos taken looking out of a plane at 32,000 feet, looking north across Michigan. And he's noticed that the software has picked up clouds in the distance, which he's calculated based on the height of the plane and the relative distance between the plane and the ground and away to the clouds, that the clouds are starting about 400 miles and reaching out to about 500 miles away from him. So from his flight path, that puts those clouds beyond Michigan and above Ontario. But we can't see any of Ontario. The software is only picking up the land to about 200 miles away. How can we see clouds that far away, but not any of Canada? Well, it might have something to do with a rather glaring mistake that Jay Tolin has done in his placement of the globe curve line, because he's got it meeting the flat Earth line in the middle, which means the distance from the plane to the ground directly below him, he is saying, is less on a flat Earth than on a globe. He's suggesting that 32,000 feet in a plane is higher on a globe than 32,000 feet on a flat Earth. How this line should actually be placed to not strawman the globe would be to have the starting point of the curved line at the same point that the flat line begins, so both would have the plane the same distance above them. He should then have the curved line angled so that it crosses the flat line at the distance where the horizon would be, which from 32,000 feet is almost 220 miles. Now, that actually fits with Jay Tolin's render much better. We can't see any of the land beyond 220 miles because the curve of Earth blocks our view, but the clouds way off in the distance are a similar altitude above the curved line than the plane is, and they're still visible. Jay Tolin pretty much pegs this to begin with without even realizing. The horizon distance on a globe is 219 miles, and when he first looked at the photos and worked out how far he could see, he pegged the distance as being just over 200 miles.
We're really seeing about, over 200 miles out.
Anyway, I think that's going to draw this video to a close. Thanks once again to World of Tanks for sponsoring this video, and don't forget to check out that sign-on bonus offer in the description below. If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.